Okay, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our the first in a series of six webinars that we're going to be doing with ALM Intelligence here and Legal Compass to kind of walk through some different scenarios of how to utilize this data to for strategy purposes, and how to utilize it to nudge attorneys and staff into different directions. My name is Patrick Fuller. I am the Vice President of Legal Intelligence at ALM Intelligence. Joining me today is going to be Rob Alston, who is our Senior Director of Sales at ALM Intelligence, and our special guest is Lisa Simon, who is the Chief Marketing and Business Development Officer at Lewis, Roca, Rothgerber, and Christie. She is based in Phoenix. The idea today, everyone, is to kind of walk through a couple of different scenarios with regard to peer identification, comparisons, and benchmarking. And of course, we're going to be utilizing the data within Legal Compass and the functionality on Legal Compass. But more importantly, we want to talk with Lisa about how this type of data is used within the firm, especially as we get into retreat season. You know, one of the things over my career that I've been able to do is do a lot of retreats, sometimes in some really great locations, other times in not so great locations. But it was always interesting to be able to get a group of attorneys together and be able to show comparisons and where the market was going, how they were sitting in the market, and utilizing that as a way of helping to facilitate discussions around strategy. And that's what we want to talk about just kind of briefly today, is how we can use this data in a way that enables us to create that visual, especially as we start getting into retreat season. So with that, I want to introduce Lisa very quickly. As I mentioned, she is the Chief Marketing and Business Development Officer at Lewis, Roca, Rothgerber, and Christie in Phoenix. Prior to that, she was at Lathrop and Gage, and prior to that was at Brownstein for a number of years. She's a 2017 inductee into the Legal Marketing Association Hall of Fame. I've known her forever. She is one of the best people in this business, and one of the trusted advisors for a lot of us in this business as well. So Lisa, welcome, and I appreciate you taking some time today. Also joining us, as I mentioned, is Rob Alston. Rob and I have worked together for about 10 years, give or take, in various capacities in a couple of different organizations. Rob joined us this past year, and Rob is our Senior Director of Sales. He's leading sales for Legal Compass, and Rob is going to be taking us through this today. So Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Really appreciate that intro. And Lisa, really appreciate you taking time to come out and visit with us. What we know is a busy time for law firms right now. So with that and a tight meeting here with 30 minutes, I'm going to get right to it. I just want to ask you a couple questions. You know, we're in fall season, as Patrick mentioned, where it's not just more football and the midterms that people are talking about a little bit in November. It's when attorneys get together and start their planning and review of how they want their law firm to perform, and what are some of the key initiatives and things they're going to be thinking about. And for administrative leaders like yourself, to support them, you're thinking about things that might help them in that process. Well, what are the initiatives or types of information that you try to get together for them as you help them prepare? Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure, and it's pretty timely. We are actually in the middle of planning 4 different retreats right now. We've got one in a couple weeks for one of our practice groups. We've got 2 more after that, and then we're actually planning our firm-wide all-attorney retreat that will be shortly after the beginning of the year. So, keeping that in mind, that these retreats can look like, just either industry, practice group, or full firm sectors. For us, it's an opportunity to get the attorneys together and to get them rowing in the same direction. And I know it's a bit cliche, but I think that piece is often overlooked because practice group leaders want to use it as a way of getting, a lot of business stuff taken care of that, frankly, I think they could spend that time in their practice group meetings doing a lot of that. And I think using retreats to, again, get all of the attorneys together, whether it's by practice group or the full firm. I think that's an overlooked opportunity. So I tend to see retreats following three main themes, and it's really how do we get our attorneys to know each other better? How do we leverage those internal relationships to get new clients or even grow existing clients? But then there's always that context of the state of the firm or the state of the practice group. And to me, that's one of the most important components of retreat, to set the stage for how the practice group is doing or how the firm is doing, and matching that up or benchmarking that against peers.
That's great. And, on number three, what are, over your career, you've been doing this for a little while, as Patrick mentioned, and you've worked with a variety of firms and executive committees, and so what are some of the different criteria that you have used to help you identify peers?
Well, again, I think a lot of times firms tend to, and especially executive leaders of firms, again, getting to that state of the firm address or state of the practice group address, we think a lot about laterals. We think a lot about how the firm is doing, and without providing that context, I think lawyers just look at a lot of that data and they're not really sure what to do with it. What does that mean for them? And so, you get that parade of presentations where maybe the CFO will get up and here's what's going on in the financial part of the firm, and here's the CMO, and that person's going to get up and talk about this. And there's really that missed opportunity of putting this all into context and explaining how the firm is doing relative to its peers. And so whether you're doing it by practice group or whether you're doing it for the full firm, being able to look at things like, geography, where certain offices are and how the practice or the firm stacks up against that. One of the other factors is looking at things like leverage, that I think is an overlooked data point that I think firms can look at to consider how the culture might be relative to its peers. Thinking about margins, thinking about revenue per lawyer, just looking at all of those different stats and giving the lawyers that North Star, that ability to say, all right, here's how we're doing, here's how our peers are doing, which direction do we want to go? How do we use this and determine what we want to look like in a year? And I think, again, I don't see executives thinking about that when they're preparing for retreats. They just want to spit out a bunch of garbage, not really explain how it fits into the bigger picture. And being able to use data like this, I think, can be really helpful to put the information into context.
Lisa, one of the things and you bring up a great point there, one of the things that I've often run into over the years is the confusion between peers and competitors. Sometimes they can be the same, right? There are obviously going to be situations where you have firms that you've identified as peers through a variety of the criteria that you just pointed out that you're also going to compete with for business in certain areas, certain practice areas, certain industries. But too often when you talk to some of the leadership sometime in firms, especially on the attorney side, is you start talking about peers and they immediately default to, well, this is who we compete with. And there could be a big difference, especially for benchmarking purposes and analysis between those two. And that's part of what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, that's a great point, Patrick. And I just switched gears here for a moment. So those that are viewing on your screen, you'll see now that I've opened up the home site for Legal Compass, our solution that really does have a lot of incredible, not only proprietary intel, but to the application that Lisa just spoke to, really a lot of information that can help you identify peers. And as she stated eloquently, how that helps bring context for the attorneys, whether they're looking at the firm level or even at a practice group level, about things that matter in terms of how the firm wants to produce in the following year. And so this is a great way for us just to show you in that context what we can do. So law firm search is right here, and I'm just going to sort of use an example. It took a few of the elements that Lisa just described. So I'm actually going to go in here, and as you can see, the first thing I have is locations. So for the firms we're tracking up here, I can actually go in and look in the threshold. So we can go global, but this is a U.S. example. So I'm actually going to look at, I could go into individual cities, but I'm actually, for this example, just going to go into specific regions. Maybe these are regions that our attorneys want to look at. So in this one, I'm going to go Mountain, Midwest, and I'm going to go West. The other thing that a lot of law firms do for that context is they want to look at what's the actual, I just got to move this out of the way so I can actually get to my bar here. 1 second. There we go. I need to be able to look at some other criteria that are going to really help bring that context into focus. So the first one I'm going to use is just total lawyers. How big is the firm? And so I'm going to go right up here and click on that. And then I'm going to go ahead and just use a range here of 300 to 600 lawyers. When I click on go, that's going to cut down this list pretty considerably. And you can see that's 72 now. A couple other things that, just for example, that I might pull into this list in my advanced find with Legal Compass is cost per lawyer. So I can go down here and actually do cost per lawyer. And I can actually add that as less than 500,000. So we do that. And that gets me to 43, so I got a pretty strong, solid list, but there's a few other things I might want to review as well. So maybe RPL is something, revenue per lawyer, that I want to also look at. And then within that, I'm also going to do a range. And for this example, I'm going to do 600,000 to 900,000. And I am getting my results, and that's looking very good. I now have 17 strong peers in meeting all this criteria, and just a couple more. So let's look at profitability as well with profit per equity partner, and let's go ahead and make that a range of 500,000 to 800,000. And now I have 8 results. So I have a very strong list. The last thing is, we talked about the geography. We've talked about some key performance indicators for the health of these firms that are similar. Now the other thing, and size, but the other thing I might want to do is look at the scope using their offices, so the number of offices that they have. And so this will be my last one, but I just want to put in a greater than or equal to 9. And when I do that, that's going to give me 10 offices or more. And so now I have my list of 6. So what I want to do is actually just go in here and pick some of these firms and get a little bit more of that analysis and a comparison. And I can click on my compare right here to do that. So now we're taking all of the data that we have, and we have a great collection of data across the historical archive, as you can see. So I really want to look at the last 3 years, so I'm going to apply that to my search for these firms. And simply what I can do now, as you can see, it's brought up to 3 years. I have a tremendous number of criteria across revenue and profits that I can show you across. I'm going to go ahead and close that for a second so you can see all the rest. But firm size, diversity, pro bono, technology rankings, A-list, and mid-level. For our example, I'm just going to go revenue, profits, firm size, diversity, and you can see it's populating all of this on the fly. Now I have a pretty robust report with a lot of information to compare about these peers and to give that context that Lisa was speaking about. I can also simply print or export all of this right here. And just for time, I went ahead and downloaded this very report so you can see in Excel exactly what you would get across all of these measures. So certainly those particularly handy with Excel would be able to do a lot more graphs and charts and nice comparisons that they could present for their partners and attorneys to give that context. So just a little bit of the opportunity using our law firm search to really identify the peers that meet certain thresholds that you're looking for. Okay? Hey,
Rob,
switch gears. Yeah,
Rob,
go
one
ahead.
of the things that was interesting is that Womble Carlisle popped up in that, and as most of everybody attending knows, Womble and Bond Dixon merged. One of the reasons why that was important that showed up, and I want to make sure I remind everybody in the audience about this, is that we do keep the historical information on firms that have gone out of business and firms that have merged. So from an analyst perspective, and one of the things I like to do when I was doing this type of work on a regular basis was, there'd be times I'd want to go back and I'd want to look at the financials of firms pre-merger, especially if we were working on a merger with a firm. I'd want to go back and look at pre-merger for the two firms that were involved, and then look at post-merger and what actually changed during that period. What did the merger actually affect? Right? Did profitability increase? Was there attrition? Did revenue per lawyer go up, go down? Where was it relative to the market? How did it compare to other firms that had merged? Is there a pattern that was there? Likewise with firms that had, ceased to exist, and there was a few of those, unfortunately, as well. As what markers were there that we could see? So, one of the reasons when Rob did that search that Womble popped up was the fact that we still had their data in there for 2018, and that's an important thing to note, because that's I think a very powerful piece of information to be able to have access to that level of historical data for those purposes and many, many more as well.
That's great color. Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. Yep, a lot happening. A lot of consolidation continues. So it's great that we're tracking a lot of that information post and pre and upcoming. We'll be showing you how our new mergers and acquisitions modeling tool really helps with not only looking at potential mergers that you as law firms may be thinking about, but from a competitive standpoint, seeing the positioning of changes that will occur with other law firms that may merge. So Lisa, going back to you, we shared a lot of information about how we might try to identify different peers based on a threshold, but a lot of times your attorneys know who they're up against, and so do you, right? Especially in your role as CMO and Chief Business Development Officer. When you have specific firms that you already know about, what's and Patrick kind of talked at the front of the call about the nudging of attorneys. What kind of insider information are you looking to gain that will, help spirit the right things with your attorneys as they think about how they execute either in their practice or for the overall firm?
Well, it's a little complicated because you're dealing with lawyers who, first of all, like to argue against all the data that you're showing them and explain why it's wrong. And then you just get a lot of suspicion. And so I think there's a couple things at play here. One, if you're trying to use this information to say, look, here's where we are as a firm, or here's how we are as a practice, and this is the direction we want to go. I think one of the things I hear a lot, regardless of where I'm working, is the notion of culture. Well, so if you show, all right, these are the firms that we aspire to look like, either in terms of revenue or leverage or whatever that is, and you get this common pushback around, well, yeah, but that's a sweatshop, or, well, yeah, but I know that they're miserable at that firm, or whatever that is. They'll continue to just give you arguments around why that's not something we should look toward. So I really think you can use this to slice and dice and find that peer set that they look to, that the lawyers do want to somehow emulate in terms of, again, whether it's leverage or it's margin, to get them to move in the direction that you're trying to get them. So again, when I'm working with either an executive committee or practice group leaders to try and inspire and align a group of attorneys to go in a certain direction, you got to be prepared for that pushback. And so going back and forth and identifying what you think that peer set is based on some of that criteria that you outlined, going out and testing it a little bit with some of your attorneys to say, what do you think about this? Are these the firms that you consider our peers? And they'll start to argue back and forth about why they are or why they aren't. And you can continue to refine that list based on that feedback you get. And then you really do get a good set of peers, because those are the firms that we're trying to look like. Those are the firms that we're trying to aspire to be.
That's a great point, because Lisa, I think the thing that you're getting there, I think the key word there is engagement.
Yeah. I mean, if this is a presentation and you're just spitting this data out again, if you're just spitting it out and they're listening to it, they're just going to continue to make those arguments about why that's not valid for them. So if you're going out and you're testing it and trying to get some information back on why that is or that isn't the right set, then hopefully you can get rid of some of those arguments when you're trying to get them moving in the right direction.
And when you're doing that, are you looking at that strategically, and you're saying, okay, these are the attorneys within the firm that I know others will follow. So this is the guiding coalition that I need to go out and I need to make sure that I engage in this and I get on board.
Yeah, and I think
everybody else follows. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you need a good mixture, because you need some of the rainmakers, because those are clearly people who have followers. But you also have to keep in mind that you're going to get some that don't want to work that hard, some that's not their mindset. So you need some of just the leaders who people respect but may not necessarily fall into that category. And if you get a good mixture of both, then I think you've got a good set.
Yeah, makes sense.
That's a great answer. So there's a little bit of work that has to be done with building that sort of consensus of lawyers about, which firms are important to benchmark. And it sounds like, Lisa, more information is better for sometimes helping you maybe disprove some old notions. And also, our market's very fluid, right? So things are always changing. So being able to keep up with that and not just live on the thought that you think you know that firm the way they used to be, but do you really know them now in terms of some things that are happening? And so that's really great information. The other thing I heard is the lawyers will know specific firms that they want you to think about. And so one great thing that I'll point to just for a minute on Legal Compass and helping you with that is really, we already showed you a little bit of what's available with Law Firm Search. Legal Compass is very comprehensive, so we don't have enough time today. There's a lot of different areas where you can do some benchmarking. But we actually have a benchmarking tool, and it does some really great, unique things. Most of all, though, helping you use it for measuring against specific competitors you know about, or others you just peers you want to benchmark against. And that is very unique, because there are some other certainly intelligence providers in the market, but some of the challenges that some of them have is that the way they collect the data requires them to anonymize the actual peers. So you can't sometimes always select the specific peer and measure a lot of different things. That's not the case with Legal Compass. We can help you with that. For this example, though, I just want to show you Dorsey, a Midwest firm, I'm going to throw in here. And then I created, as any of our clients or subscribers can do, a list. And this was about a dozen competitors that we put together through the Midwest, Central regions that we knew were pretty strong competitors of Dorsey's. And so I'm able to simply apply that and apply the filter here, and it brings up a nice scorecard for us. And that scorecard tells us a lot. It tells us about how Dorsey is competing against that median peer group we've assembled. Their revenue growth is actually a little ahead here. Revenue per lawyer is really strong against the group, a little ahead there. And it's also a reversal when we look at the trend of where Dorsey has been. Cost per lawyer, a little above the peer group here. It's showing green with that. They're keeping their cost in check, it looks like, a little bit as their revenue has grown back, and you're seeing that in their margin. Now, this is interesting, and Patrick and Lisa, I would have you weigh into this because you just both talked about leverage. I mean, maybe leverage is even part of the firm's strategy. And AmLaw 200, I know for myself, as I have worked with Encompass and with clients, and even our editors within ALM have been talking a lot about we're seeing the largest law firms work on their leverage ratio, but typically it's the other way than where Dorsey is. They're actually adding a lot of associates and maybe de-equitizing some of their partners. But here it looks like Dorsey, at least if I read it right, is actually probably trying to put more of the high value work with their partner lawyers. And that's clear based on this pretty strong variance. What do you think about that?
Well, this is Patrick. I think a couple of things. I mean, for any firm, one of the things I would look at with leverage is, does that impede, it's not just any of the firms listed here, but does it impede their ability to engage with various fee arrangements in different ways, right? So firms with really, really strong leverage, are they more likely, or do they have a greater likelihood of engaging in more fixed fee arrangements or types of alternative fee arrangements that can benefit from having really strong leverage numbers? And if they can't, is there a way that we can utilize that from a competition perspective? Now, we've seen various examples of firms over the last couple of years that have taken divergent strategies to attaining different KPIs. One firm in particular over the last year has done a really good job of adding high-end laterals that really drove their revenue, but it did also offer a dip in their profitability. And but it didn't really. It ended up right-sizing to some degree because they were really highly leveraged previously. It really kind of right-sized their leverage. Different firms are going to have different strategies. It's interesting when you start comparing it like this, and you establish a peer group that you want to look at, is how do we actually compare against these? And for something like leverage, it's not that far off, but it is interesting to be able to see that data set.
Yeah, and I would echo that, just because I've been in firms where the model that you described, Patrick, is exactly the goal. And so you're trying to bring in some of those high-profile laterals specifically for that reason. But doing something like this helps you see the impact of that. So if you're looking at what you're doing and just understanding what that greater impact is going to be, then you can go into that strategy with a lot more knowledge. And the inverse is true. I think sometimes firms overlook the importance of leverage, again, within the context of everything else. And so understanding that trend and what the impact is going to be on everything else, I think, is an important component. So it's not necessarily one's good and one's bad, although I might argue that it is. But just understanding how that's going to impact everything else, I think, is an important lever in all of this.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would point out here, Rob, just very quickly, the other thing I would point out too is getting into some of the diversity information and the comparisons. I think a lot of people on the call, if they're not familiar with the Mansfield rule, they'll probably be Googling after this that Karen Stacy and Diversity Lab are doing. That's actually going to be on Legal Compass here very shortly as well. But with more and more companies now pledging to enforce the Mansfield rule, the ability to look at both gender diversity and overall diversity as well in the context of comparison, I think it's going to be extremely important, especially as firms look to set their strategy, right? And they look to be able to say, okay, where are we lacking? Where do we need to grow? Because it can also impact recruiting to some degree if the numbers historically are bad, and there may not be a place where some people want to actually go. So this becomes a pretty interesting way of looking at this data and chunking it up.
Yeah, and to your point, I just went ahead and shared the chart view of all the key performance indicators, including diversity, that are included. But just to also hit on a point that I was sharing is some of the actual firms that made up this list, we can actually look at them specifically. So rather than using the watch list of the preference of peer firms we had, just wanted to make sure everyone understood that capability was actually available. And the final thing I would make you aware of is that the scatter plot capability, which a lot of clients like to use to get, Lisa, your word of context keeps ringing with me. Sometimes they want that broader context. They want to see how they're doing against the larger set of law firms. So maybe that's the AmLaw 200 or the Global 100. And within that, maybe they want to look at the correlation of some of these key performance indicators on each other. So I'll use a pretty easy one that most would expect would be correlated in revenue per lawyer and profit per equity partner, because we just spent a moment on that, kind of looking about that and leverage with Dorsey. But now when I apply my AmLaw 200, I can look at it in this very nice scatter plot format, and it will then bring back how these firms that I've selected are doing in that broader context. It takes a moment just to get them all in there, but then you can clearly see there's a pretty strong correlation between the firms we were looking at with their RPL and their profits per equity partner. And if I want to print or download all of that, I can. So just to summarize, there's a lot of great capability built within Legal Compass, really to help the lawyers understand. Certainly they have the firms that are in their mind that they specifically want to have some peer analysis done on, but there's also a way to go in and identify, particularly as the market continues to be changing, and really allow for you to be in a position to provide a lot of that key data that can help them understand where they're going and to give that context that Lisa talked about. Hey, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Patrick. I want to thank Lisa again for her time and opportunity for us to hear from a client's voice about peer analysis. And so with that, I'll let you wrap for us, Patrick.
Thanks, Rob. Lisa, we looked at this data, and there's certainly, we could probably spend hours talking about data and how we utilize it to nudge attorneys and to drive strategy. From this conversation, though, any final takeaways that you might have?
I think that there is a way to use data like this to drive a group of lawyers, whether it's a practice group or a firm, to a certain behavior. It might be something as simple as financial hygiene, like making sure you're getting your bills out on time, and what impact does that have on RPL? I mean, that could really have an impact. So I think there's ways of using this to drive a certain behavior. The other thing I would add, and I'm probably unwittingly teeing up your next webinar, but it's this idea of using this data around what impact is a decision going to make on the trajectory of the firm. So if you're looking at some of this data, do you want to make a decision to refine and define or grow? And so if you look at that peer set and decide, all right, we're going to stay this size, we're going to cast off some practices, this is what we want to be, let's look at some of our peers and see what the impact of that decision was. Or if we want to grow, let's look at some peers and decide that impact. So there's so much here. It's just how do you want to use it to drive behavior?
Yeah, Lisa, and thank you for the segue, because we are going to tee that up on the next webinar. We're going to get into M&A lateral growth, and one of the things we're actually going to talk about is the cost of that growth as well. I think one of the things that was really interesting from the last we saw with Venable, their acquisition of Fitzpatrick, is $80 million moved you 5 spots in the projected. It was projected to move them 5 spots in the AmLaw rankings, and if you start thinking about it in those terms, and we often do in law firms, you will often hear the attorneys say, hey, we really want to be, the top in X. We are in the top 50 or the top 75. And sometimes the question becomes is how much cost is associated with that move? And is there going to be an ROI sufficient with that we have to consider? And this is where data becomes our best friend, because all of us on this call and everybody listening to this call at some point in time in our careers, probably more often than not, have used data to justify saying no. And so we always talk about all the things that you can do with this. Let's be very honest with each other. One of the things we often do with this is utilize it to justify saying no to something that just doesn't make strategic sense. And that's, I think, a very important usage. Guys, we are out of time. In fact, we're over by 4 minutes. I'm going to chalk that up to Rob's southern drawl, being from Texas, not the fact that I talk too much. Lisa, I cannot thank you as always enough. So we appreciate it very, very much. And we definitely owe you. That tab, as you mentioned to me before, is really long. So I appreciate it. For everybody that attended, please email Rob or myself or with any questions that you might have, or the representatives, Kevin or Jeff, that you work with. We're happy to answer any questions. Thank you to everyone for attending today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.